As Brian said, my talk, the title of my talk is the first line, really, of an article from the influential journal called The Builder, which still exists today, although now it's called Building, for reasons which seem to me obscure. But in any case, what you're seeing on the screen now is a page of The Builder from the 4th of June, 1859, which has been pasted into the minutes of the meetings of the trustees of Sir John Soane's Museum. The article took stock of the museum some 20 years after it opened to the public, and it made some rather pointed comments. I'll read a few of them to you. The remarkable architectural museum, collections, and library left to the nation by the late Sir John Soane should be made of greater service to the nation than it has yet been. His desire was to benefit the public to the utmost, and until architects and the public have the utmost possible benefit from his noble endowment, his desire will not be fulfilled. The museum is visited by hundreds instead of thousands. The books and drawings are safe and untouched, carefully locked up, and useless. There is a locked-up air, indeed, about the whole house. Visitors, when they have obtained a card and gained admission, feel that they are there on sufferance and would no more think of asking for a case or a drawer to be opened than they would in any private house to which they'd gained access by the courtesy of the proprietor to glance at the pictures. And you may just be able to make out here some handwritten notes at the bottom and occasionally in the margins, which are the writing of George Bailey, who was the long-serving first curator of the museum, trying to correct factual errors and rebutting some of the Snyder comments in the article. Now, the comparison with a private house is noteworthy as it underscores the ambivalent nature of a house museum, and we've talked about this yesterday. But in this case, a house museum that was also intended to serve as a public resource. The article concluded by asking the trustees and curator to reconsider the opening hours and let the public more fully enjoy its own. This was neither the first nor the last such criticism aimed at what had been conceived by John Soane in a spirit of public munificence. And how could this have come about? To answer that, one must return to the history of the house and collection in the owner's lifetime. At the end of his 6th Royal Academy lecture on architecture, he was professor of architecture at the Royal Academy from 1806, John Soane announced that his house would be open to students of the Academy on the day before and the day after his lecture. He did this so that the drawings, the plaster casts, the architectural fragments alluded to in his texts would be available for consultation. Already by 1812, Soane was beginning to contemplate the public-facing role of his collection, what it could play in what was already being referred to as an academy of architecture. Soane was also aware of the fact that a number of aristocratic collections in London and elsewhere were open to the public for inspection. In 1809, John Britton, Soane's antiquarian friend and sometime ally, presented him with a copy of his guidebook to Corsham House in Wiltshire, which included a catalogue of its picture collection. Published in 1806, the book was one of a long line of publications extending back into the first half of the 18th century, which catalogued notable collections. Among these was another publication by Britton of the catalogue raisonné of the Marquis of Stafford's house, picture collection at Cleveland House in London, which had appeared in 1808. In the foreword to that catalogue, Britton explained the laudable motive for making such collections accessible was for the melioration of society and the expansion of the human intellect. This was a common enough gesture on the part of aristocratic and wealthy collectors, and here we're looking at a view of part of Charles Townley's famous collection of antiquities in his house in Park Street, which in 1806 was given in its entirety to the British Museum, and a special wing of the museum was built to house it. In John Soane's case, a critical fact behind his magnanimity was the death of his wife, Eliza, in 1815, and the bitter disappointment he felt over the careers of his sons, John and George. Here, the three of them seen in happier times. The younger John initially followed his father's footsteps and became an architect, although his heart wasn't in it, and he eventually gave it up, predeceasing his father in 1823. George, on the other hand, saw himself as a man of letters and also a man of the theatre, but he ended up alienating his parents through a series of public and private attacks, as well as ill-advised marriage. Thus, like many collectors, John Soane lavished his attention and affection upon his house and collection, which became, in effect, his children and heirs. And this is something that I think both Tims yesterday mentioned apropos Charles Fortnum. And indeed, I think it's a common denominator for many collectors that they adopt their collection as their children. This also explains, I think, the rapid expansion of Soane's collection throughout the 1820s, which led eventually to the publication of a volume overseen by the same John Britton, called The Union of Architecture, Sculpture, and Painting, exemplified by the House and Galleries of John Soane, which appeared in 1827. And here we're looking at the frontispiece of the book, a very elaborate illustration showing the monk's parlor, and up above a glimpse of the picture room, which had only recently been completed. And then in the distance, you see a mirror which is reflecting the stained glass windows behind the desk in the foreground, a typically complicated, complex image of what Soane created in the monk's parlor and indeed elsewhere in the building. Correspondence between Britton and Soane indicates that this was a joint project for an elaborate illustrated folio volume dedicated to the house and collection, and it was already underway in 1824. Britton wrote to Soane that he hoped to produce a very interesting and curious volume, one that will perpetuate your name when your buildings are leveled to the dust, something that probably didn't go down well with Soane. The narrative was composed by a journalist named Leeds, although the messaging throughout was clearly Soane's, and Soane advanced £550 for the publication. In the event, it was the project rather than Soane's buildings that crumbled first. The deluxe volume sank under its own weight. Britton was compelled to reduce the price of the volumes, which still did not sell, and the two men fell out over the cost for a number of years until Soane finally reimbursed Britton for his total costs in 1835. Now, however cumbersome Britton's union proved, its subtext was clear. Architects needed a national academy to raise their standing above mere builders. Whereas the British Museum contained a few architectural fragments from classical antiquity, and the Royal Academy did not accord architecture significant recognition, Soane's collection sought to rectify that situation. And here I'm showing you a view by his amanuensis, Joseph Michael Gandy, of the museum corridor next to the picture room as it was furnished in 1825. And the central piece in the drawing is the capital and the entablature of the Temple of Castor and Pollux in Rome. And then on the right, a lecture drawing by Soane, by Soane's office, which shows the challenges of getting the measure of classical architecture in Rome and the advantage that Soane's collection could offer, as indeed other collections of plaster casts, whereby people could look at these things at eye level and without danger of falling to their death. As an assemblage of architectural fragments and models, the collection was trumpeted by John Britton in his The Union of Architecture, Sculpture, and Painting as unrivaled in Great Britain and setting an example that deserves to be adopted by the government. The deployment also of color, stained glass, and mirrors and vistas were also dealt with by John Britton in some detail, who said that they reflected the genius of their creator in combining the three arts in a beautiful ensemble. And mirrors are, of course, a conspicuous feature in the house and museum proper. And here we see a detail of one in the dining room. They are especially conspicuous in the breakfast room, which is one of the most admired and imitated spaces in the building. And it was later described by Soane himself in the following words: "The views from this room into the monument court and into the museum, the mirrors in the ceiling and the looking glasses, combined with the variety of outline and general arrangement in the design and decoration of this limited space, present an almost infinite succession of those fanciful effects which constitute the poetry of architecture." And in fact, as you can see here, on the right is the monument court, so-called, and then through the window towards the left is what he would refer to as the museum proper, which actually occupies the area that in the 17th century, when the square was laid out, would have been a yard or stables. Soane set out to remedy the defects of John Britton's work in what would become 3 successive editions of his own guidebook, which he called A Description of the House and Museum on the North Side of Lincoln's Inn Fields. And it first appeared in 1830. And this is one of the lithographs from that first edition of the dining room as it appeared at that date. Privately printed, the book was intended for distribution to libraries, societies, and influential people. And some 250 copies of that first edition were printed. In 1832, a second edition, slightly different, was printed, of which numbered at 106, and half of these also had a French translation, so he was thinking of an international market for it. And of the final expanded version of 1835-36, 150 copies were printed. The narrative throughout was much more succinct and much closer to a guidebook intended to accompany a visit to the house, with plans, elevation, and 17 plates to illustrate the main rooms. It also imposed a sense of the visit clockwise in the first 2 editions and anti-clockwise in the third. The purpose of a description is clearly stated by Soane in the introduction. The objects of this work are chiefly to trace, by reference to the figures on the geometrical plans, the relative situations of the several rooms and communications in this house and museum, to notice some of the principal works of ancient and modern art, and lastly, to show by graphic illustration the connection between painting, sculpture, and architecture. Throughout these editions, Soane dwelt upon provenance and the aesthetic effect of the rooms and their contents, but fought shy of any detailed analysis of the collection. As we've seen before, one of the things that appealed to collectors, particularly of this period, was owning something that had belonged to Napoleon or to the Duke of York or the Baron Cawdor. And certainly Soane was no exception to that. And he goes out of his way to highlight these elements in his brief commentary on the works. Soane also announced in this description that his house museum and library would be open 2 days a week during several months in the year for amateurs and students. After his death, the property would descend to his grandson, John Soane, who is the son of his deceased son, also called John, with sufficient funds to enable him to maintain and use the house, museum, and library in the same manner as during my lifetime. If, as happened, his grandson died without a male heir, then the whole, according to Soane's words, would be vested in the executors of his will and administered until a National Academy for Architecture should be established. But events took a different turn the following year, 1833, with the establishment of the House and Collections as a national museum by Act of Parliament, something that Soane was much concerned with. And this did occur with controversy, as many considered Soane's decision to cut off his younger son, George, and George's children as unnatural. But Soane prevailed in this. However, left hanging in the air were the further questions of the purpose and functioning of such a museum after the lifetime of Sir John. In the summer of 1835, Soane dispatched multiple copies of the description across the United Kingdom and beyond. And here is the frontispiece of the 1835, in which Soane actually appears, though in the guise of his bust by Sir Francis Chantrey. In fact, when the Act of Parliament was passed, he had the bust transferred from a private part of his house to the dome area where it sits today. Interestingly enough, Soane kept a list of the recipients of the book, as well as transcriptions of acknowledgements that he received, which makes fascinating reading. Among others, copies were sent to the King and Queen, the Princess Victoria and her mother, the Duchess of Kent, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of London, the libraries of the House of Commons, the House of Lords, the kings of Saxony and Bavaria, the Emperor of Austria, and Princes Metternich and Esterhazy. In addition, various academies in France and Belgium were recipients of a copy, as was the Governor of the Bank of England and the President of the Royal Academy. And even the newly installed United States Minister, Andrew Stevenson, was favored with a copy. In addition, Soane sent copies to old friends as well as Royal Academicians and architects, including Barry, Beechey, Chantrey, Eastlake, and Westmacott. It was one of his last official acts on behalf of his bequest to the nation. And here is an engraving from the 1835 description with one of the most famous rooms in the collection, which you probably know, the picture room with the panels open to the picture room recess, and you see in the distance Westmacott's nymph, and in the center, extraordinary Anglo-Indian ivory table and matching chairs, and on top of it, somewhat improbably, is placed the corridor vase, one of the largest of the Greek vases in his collection. John Soane died on the 20th of January, 1837, and in his will, he appointed George Bailey, his long-serving assistant, who started with him in 1810, as curator, and his housekeeper, Sally Conduit, to serve under Bailey as an inspectress. Soane was thus institutionalizing a hierarchy already in place during the latter years of his life. The Act of Parliament vested numbers 12 and 13 Lincoln's Inn Field in trustees. These were the first two houses that he built on the north side of the field. And the trustees were instructed to give free access to the public, at least on 2 days in every week throughout the months of April, May, and June, and at such other times as the trustees shall direct, to amateurs and students in painting, sculpture, and architecture, for consulting and inspecting and benefiting by the said collection. The trustees and their successors, it continues, shall not, except in the case of absolute necessity, suffer the arrangement in which the said museum shall be left to be altered. There was provision for an endowment of £30,000 from Soane's estate, as well as the rent from number 12, which would produce an income of approximately £1,100 a year to support the running of the museum. And this was the status quo in terms of the running of the museum down to World War II. Unwittingly, however, Soane was setting up here problems that successive curators and trustees grappled with over the next century and a half. The original 4 life trustees were friends and associates of and included the sculptor Francis Chantrey, who was a long-standing confidant of Soane's and a power within the Royal Academy. 4 additional trustees were appointed for 5-year terms, and they represented bodies of which Soane had been a fellow, such as the Royal Academy, the Royal Society, the Society of Antiquaries, and the Society for the Advancement of the Arts. And 1 trustee would also represent the Court of Aldermen of the City of London. The trustees met for the first time a little over 2 weeks after the founder's death, and the first visitors were admitted by ticket on the 4th of April, 1837. Nonetheless, there was puzzlement among the public over the purpose of the museum, as well as the quixotic nature of Soane's architectural legacy. And this is an illustration from the Illustrated London News of 1864 showing the Egyptian sarcophagus in the dome area and the Apollo Belvedere above. This issue was raised in 1837 in an article in a magazine with the wonderful Victorian title of The Penny Magazine for the Society of the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. While containing many admiring observations about the building, its interiors and collection, the article echoes some of the points that had been raised a few years earlier in the debate in Parliament over the purpose and function of the museum. To admit the public indiscriminately into a small private house, it writes, in the same way as they are admitted into the British Museum or any other national depository of art, would not only be incurring the risk of loss and damage, but it would be defeating the uses of the property. And what, it may be asked, is the practical use of Sir John Soane's house and museum? And to what extent, too, will it be considered proper to open the library to the artist and the architectural student? These considerations affect the utility of the collection, and if only a limited few are permitted to have a practical use of the house and museum, Sir John Soane's intentions will be rendered inoperative. The trustees are anxious to fulfill their trust and to open the collection as far as possible to the public. The difficulty seems to be how to make proper arrangements consistently with the preservation and security of the property. The article may have been prompted by the large numbers of visitors who flocked to the museum immediately after its opening. But accessibility was then and remains now a legitimate concern for a museum on the scale of the Soane. In point of fact, John Soane never seems to have thought through the disposition of areas within the house for public consultation or, indeed, offices. Thus, as we have seen, it's not surprising that some 20 years after this article, and following a precipitous drop in the number of visitors, the builder asked the same questions, but more pointedly. Now, it could be said that Sir John Soane's single-minded focus on preserving his house and collections unaltered posed insurmountable difficulties. Yet, change began occurring early on. For example, one of the most famous works in the collection, Hogarth's A Rake's Progress, was removed from the picture room and placed on folding stands in the south drawing room in 1849, remaining there until 1891. In addition, the ivory table, which I mentioned, that had been in the picture room, together with the chairs, matching chairs, believed to have been formerly in the possession of Tipu Sultan, were moved to the same location, that is, to the south drawing room, in an effort to increase the circulation of visitors in the picture room. Visitor numbers in those early years hovered around 3,000, but opening hours changed frequently, much to the frustration of the general public. Indeed, many of the changes put into effect during the latter part of the 19th century were attempts to grapple with issues of accessibility, and more particularly with lighting. James Wilde, who served as curator from 1878 until his death in 1893, went to great, even extreme lengths to ring the changes by building a new picture room at the back of number 12 Lincoln's Inn Field, where Soane's office and then his first picture gallery once stood. This occurred in 1889 and 1890 and necessitated the demolishing of whatever structure had been there from Soane's time. To this day, we don't know what it was. Also during this period, the cork model of Pompeii and its model stand was cut in half and moved, and this half was moved to the north drawing room, while the anteroom, off the breakfast room, which we looked at a moment ago, was doubled in size and denuded of much of its contents. Here you can see on the left a view of it before the recent restoration to its correct proportions and to the original sequence of works of art. The reason why we could do this, and indeed most of the changes that I'll mention in a few minutes, is that whenever Soane finished a room, he always had a watercolor done of it. A generation later, it would have been a photograph, no doubt. And also from 1833, George Bailey, under Soane's supervision, conducted inventory, so we know where things were in Soane's time. So setting this back was complicated, but it was not impossible. James Wilde went so far as to propose the removal or destruction of the drawing office, the upper floor students' room adjacent to the picture room, which you see here as it was recently restored, but he died before carrying this out. Had he done that, the oldest surviving architectural studio in the country and an essential piece of the museum's fabric would have been lost. And I might say parenthetically that we began the campaign to restore this area, which involved taking down over 200 plaster casts, cleaning them, doing research into the original paint colors of the walls, the other dealing with issues with these desks, so on and so forth. In 2021, during the middle of the pandemic, but we felt it was something that was a positive story that we could sell to foundations and individuals. And at the same time, I think one of the reasons why it was successful was that it wasn't simply to restore it and then lock it up, but we now have a program twice a year of an artist in residence who will use this space to create an online exhibit. Because of this confined nature, we can't really have more than 6 people at a time in the drawing office. And the first residency has already begun. And I think that was a way in which we made the restoration of this much more attractive to potential donors. On the eve of the 20th century, electricity was brought to the Soane, and this went some way towards answering the many complaints of visitors who complained about the incredibly inconvenient mode in which a great part of the contents of the museum are arranged, so that the sculptures are scarcely within the reach of the eye or in very narrow passages and very dark corners. But letting in the light threatened to rob areas like the crypt or basement of the atmospherics that led Henry James to set one of his short stories there in 1889. Still, if we were to be transported back to the turn of the 20th century, we would find display cases in the south drawing room, again, to meet the demand to see certain star pieces, much as used to be the case in the British Museum itself, with things like the Lindisfarne Gospels. And other areas, such as the Tivoli recess, was actually converted into a lavatory in 1917 to meet the needs of the museum-going public. And it was later deconverted and returned to its original purpose as a gallery of 19th century British sculpture in 2012. Reading through the minutes of the trustees' meetings in the 1920s and the 1930s, one senses a defensive atmosphere about this restrictive number of opening days and the very purpose of the museum itself. The buildings and collection were informally restyled as Sir John Soane's House and Museum in the 1920s. And although the title never became official, it spoke to a dual mandate that the curator and trustees were intent upon. The debate over the demolition of the Bank of England in the mid-1920s, which was Soane's great architectural masterpiece, and this is a famous image from the 1st of May 1925, which appeared in the Times. This debate over the demolition of the bank stimulated public interest in the museum, and attendance at this period shot up to around 8,000 a year. But with the onset of the worldwide depression, the situation deteriorated from 1932 onwards, and the loss of income from investments effectively hampered any attempts at reform or restoration. Meanwhile, public criticism about the restrictive nature of the museum's operations continued. In 1938, the Soudley Committee, a blue ribbon panel which was concerned with making museums more accessible to the general public, had the Soane Museum in its sights. Its recommendations included making the opening hours more convenient to the public, as well as appointing a committee of museum experts to rearrange the contents of the Soane Museum so that they could be better seen. The committee made public its recommendations in a letter by its chairman, Lord Harwood, to the Times of the 11th of July, 1938, in which he expressed the hope that it may be possible, consistently with Sir John Soane's intentions, to afford further facilities to the general public, comparable with those of similar institutions open to the public. This generated a question in Parliament, and in a written reply a few days later, the government expressed the view that the museum was a private foundation and demurred from asking Parliament to intervene in its management. 1 year later, on the 26th of July, 1939, Lord Harwood again wrote to the Times, expressing disappointment that the trustees of Sir John Soane's Museum had made no effort to carry out any of the recommendations in their report, concluding, "It seems anomalous that the provisions of an Act of Parliament of 1833 should be allowed to hamper a museum of great potential usefulness, both for the students of architecture and the general public." This prompted a reply in the Times of the 3rd of August 1939 by the chairman of the Soane trustees, Sir Reginald Blomfield. He countered these arguments, arguing, 1, that the trustees are strictly bound by the terms of Sir John Soane's bequest to maintain the museum in exactly the state at which he left it at his death, and the Act of 1833 was in fact the act embodying that bequest. 2, that the greatly extended facilities desired by the committee are beyond the financial resources of the Soane Trust. If, he continued, the Sudeley Committee will provide the necessary funds, the Soane trustees will gladly see what can be done to meet their views. But I must point out to the Sudeley Committee that it seems to have misconceived the position of Sir John Soane's museum. It is not a public museum supported by the taxpayer, but a private museum established and maintained by a specific bequest. Blomfield's argument was somewhat disingenuous, since many changes, as we've seen, had taken place in the building during the 19th and early 20th century. Yet the letter does illuminate what you could call nowadays the groupthink of those governing the Soane Museum and the rather narrow view taken of the mandate in the Act of Parliament concerning the benefit of the public. To a remarkable degree, I think the debates over the purpose of the Soane Museum in the 1930s echoed those around the British Museum and its founding in the 1750s, when the concept of a public museum, and indeed the public, was a novelty. The Second World War put paid to this stalemate. In 1939, it was decided that the principal books and paintings should be removed from the Soane for storage with works from the British Museum and the National Gallery. Serious bomb damage occurred in and around the museum in 1940, which prompted the closure of the Soane for the remainder of the war. The evacuation of books, drawings, and furniture continued through 1941 and 1942. Eventually, at the end of the hostilities, John Summerson was appointed curator in succession to Arthur Bolton, and his first task was to assess the damage and outline steps for recovery. He addressed a memorandum to the trustees on the 13th of June, 1945, in which he underscored the precarious situation. After nearly 6 years of war, with repeated damage by enemy action and inadequate maintenance, the house and galleries are in a very poor condition. He proposed a plan to repair and reglaze the house and galleries with redecoration following as finances allowed. During this period, the museum remained closed to the general public, only reopening in September of 1947. The Pilgrim Trust gave 2 grants towards the reinstatement and repair of the museum in 1945 and 1946. At the same time, Summerson submitted a memorandum on the financial future of the Soane Museum to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton. This led to an initial annual grant of £2,250, which was just sufficient to keep the museum open for 240 days a year, or 5 days a week, from Tuesday through Saturday. In this way, the Soane Museum was formally brought into the network of national museums. It can be said that the restoration of the Soane Museum as we know it today actually began at this time and largely through the efforts of Sir John Summerson, who remained in post until 1984. He laid the foundations for changing what had been described as an agreeable, if largely inaccessible, curiosity into a small museum of international repute. Although Summerson's initial objectives were to restore the parlous condition of the building's fabric and to look for an augmented endowment, he diplomatically prodded the trustees to reconsider the policy and functioning of the museum. As he wrote in his memorandum of 1945, during nearly the whole of its existence, the museum has been subject to criticism for its failure to render an adequate service to students and to exhibit its material in a worthy manner to the public. Although recent attacks reveal a certain misunderstanding of the nature of the trust and its limitations under the Act of 1833, there is no question that a policy of sympathetic and progressive reform can be and must be pursued to establish the museum in public esteem. Gradually, during his long tenure, Summerson steered a course that made the Soane more accessible to the still nascent discipline of British architectural history, as well as to the public at large. At the same time, he engineered another important stage in the restoration of number 13 Lincoln's Inn Field by persuading the trustees to reoccupy number 12, which had previously been let for income. And this happened in 1969. And what I'm showing you now is the site of the museum as it is today, which includes 12, 13, and 14 Lincoln's Inn Field. And as I said, his first house was number 12, which when he moved into number 13 in 1813, he let, but taking this part of the building and adjoining it to number 13, which was, of course, has a much larger footprint. Then in 1822, as his collections expanded, he acquired number 14. He rebuilt the house as a rental and then took this area to make the picture room in the monk's parlor, so that the plan of number 13 now is a T shape. But when he died, he left 14 to his grandchildren from his son John, and 12 and 13 were the museum. And they still are officially the museum, although we now own 14 as well. The net effect of occupying number 12 was that it expanded the museum's capacity because it enabled the staff to decant workspaces from the fabric of number 13, and this policy continued under the curatorship of his successors. His immediate successor, Peter Thornton, whom some of you know and has been mentioned, it was mentioned by Miranda Rock yesterday, came well prepared to the task of being the keeper, stroke director, as he had specialized in the study of historic interiors during his years as keeper of the Department of Furniture and Woodwork at the Victoria and Albert Museum. He embarked on the first phase of restoring the interiors of the Soane to their original appearance by painting the first floor drawing rooms in the brilliant yellow and bronze green seen here and based upon studies of paint samples and also original watercolors from the 1830s by Soane's pupil C.J. Richardson. This was controversial at the time, but it set in motion a movement for further restoration, a movement that proved unstoppable. Julian Harrop architects were brought in as consultants in 1989 and have remained as essential collaborators with the Soane for over 30 years. During the 1990s, the picture room, the Shakespeare recess, the study and dressing room were brought back to their original appearances and proportions, and the Tivoli recess was recreated after its dismantling in 1917. Even Soane's pasticcio, which had been taken down in 1896, was recreated in 2004. The work initiated by Peter Thornton was continued by his successors, notably Margaret Richardson, Tim Knox, Abraham Thomas, and even down to my own day. In 1996, the trustees were able to purchase the freehold of number 14 thanks to a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund. Its acquisition enabled the re-establishment of the fine Soanian interiors in that house, and its use for a research library, the Adams Study Center, and the collection of drawings from Adams Studio, some 9,000 drawings, in fact. It also paved the way for the 7-year campaign called Open Up the Soane, which ran from 2009 to 2016. This complex project had a number of interrelated goals. It restored additional historic rooms and opened them to the public. It improved visitor facilities in terms of new cloakrooms, a shop and gallery in number 12, and the addition of 2 conservation studios in number 12 as well as introducing disabled access to the museum as a whole. And here you're seeing on the left a diagram of the changes made in number 12 Lincoln's Inn Field to create a shop, conservation studio, exhibition studios, conservation studios, and as it was a listed building, introducing a lift proved problematic, but fortunately there were 3 closets, one on top of the other on 3 successive floors, which could be cannibalized or turned into a lift, which meant that there was greater accessibility for the those with issues in movement or handicaps. Probably most remarkable was the restoration of the private apartments in number 13, which had been converted into offices, but were returned in 2013, 2015 to their original appearance. And here I'm showing you Mrs. Soane's morning room. On the right, almost finished restoration. The carpets, which are now there, hadn't been laid yet. But on the left, the way it appeared in the 1990s when it was the deputy director's office. And here the model room. On the upper right, you see the model room as it is today, where the correct proportions of the stand, which shows Pompeii and other ancient buildings in Cork, was recreated. And on the left, what it looked like in the 1990s when it was the office, basically the office of the director. My office today is a much more modest one on the floor above. And then, again, there's a lot of documentation on what the model room looked like, and this is an engraving from the 1830s, which shows it. And also, we were able, because of this, and also watercolors, to reproduce the pattern and color of the carpets on the floor. And these are the 2 galleries which were created on the first floor of number 12, which enable us to do temporary exhibitions throughout the year. And here is one of the 2 conservation studios on the floor above in number 12. Before these were opened in 2012, there was simply a sink, which was also the sink where people washed up after lunch and tea. So it was a great improvement and underwritten particularly by American supporters through the Sir John Soane Museum Foundation. So these changes and the expansion of the footprint coincided with a steady increase in the number of visitors, which rose from 10,000 a year in the 1950s to 20,000 in the 1970s, and over 135,000 in our last fiscal year. Indeed, we've recovered our pre-pandemic numbers, and last year, which ended in March, we had the highest number of visitors we've ever had. Throughout this period of reconstruction and restoration, the challenge remained reconciling improvements with the idiosyncratic character and unique atmosphere of the Soane Museum. Digital, as we saw yesterday with the Royal Collections, is one way, of course, of creating, is increasingly important as a means of raising our profile and enabling virtual visitors from across the world to savor some of the glories of our collections. Virtually all of our 40,000 objects are now online. The majority, the overwhelming majority, have images, so that if you go into our website, which is soane.org.uk, you can look at collections, you can find out information and images, some of which, most of which the images you can download for study purposes. We also have a fly-through which is called Explore Soane, which was started in 2012 and actually during the lockdown was commented upon by the New York Times and other newspapers as a fascinating way of visiting museums when the museum was closed. This is the latest addition to it, which is the picture room, which contains 118 images of works of art so that you can zero in on a painting or a drawing and you get a thumbnail description of it. Looking back from today, one can detect a synchronicity between the rehabilitation of Sir John Soane's museum and the rehabilitation of Soane's reputation as an architect. His rehabilitation as an architect took over a century to achieve, for throughout the 19th century, Soane's work was damned with faint praise or simply damned as willfully eccentric. At the same time, the museum was saved from complete marginalization by the revival of interest in Soane in the early 20th century. The 100th anniversary of his death in 1937 saw a further rise in public consciousness, and modernists and postmodernists alike found in Soane a spiritual godfather, one whose eclecticism of style and rule-breaking gave younger architects permission to experiment in a similar vein. The continuing reassessment of Soane gave weight to the parallel movement to restore his house and collection to a closer approximation of their original appearance. The restoration of Soane's properties in Lincoln's Inn Field have enabled us to appreciate what he called studies for my own mind more clearly, even if there is no one single key to what he meant by that cryptic phrase. Most people today would, however, agree that it is fortunate the museum was not reorganized along conventional lines or according to the chronological genres in the last century, as the Sudley Committee and others proposed. Moreover, it's doubtful that many would endorse the German archaeologist Adolf Michaelis's lapidary dismissal of Soane's collection as non multum sed multa, not much, but a lot. It is easy to see the forest and sometimes miss the trees. With the benefit of hindsight, we can now recognize that the 19th century concept of the museum as a systematic and chronologically organized presentation of objects, a concept that prevailed well into the 20th century, is only one way of looking at history. Our renewed interest in the history of museums and of the cabinets of curiosity from which the modern museum emerged reflects a desire to pursue diverse epistemological paths and to reconsider the museum per se as an archaeological site worthy of exploration. In this way, one could say that the 21st century has finally caught up with Sir John Soane. Thank you.